Hello, and welcome. I think it's time for us to get started. So this is session 4 in our 6-part Back to School News Literacy webinar series, and I am really excited about today's discussion with the Center for Public Integrity, focused on the Freedom of Information Act and how journalists use that to tell inclusive stories, as well as equip the public with knowledge to really drive change. Before we get started, I want to quickly say thank you to the Knight Foundation for supporting this series. A couple of quick intros before we get started on the News Literacy Project side. I'm Alexa Vaughn. I'll be moderating this session. I work on the professional and community learning team as the senior manager of educator professional learning. So I help provide news literacy professional learning to educators. And I'm sorry if you can hear the rumble. I live in Florida, so there's a big Florida storm rolling in. But I'm fairly new to the News Literacy Project team. So if you would like to connect, my email is in the bottom left corner at avolland@newslit.org. A little bit about me. I'm a former journalist and fact checker. For the past couple of years, I've been focusing on media literacy and misinformation. If there are any journalism teachers in the house, I'm really passionate about student journalism. And before joining NLP, and prior to that, I was a journalism teacher in St. Petersburg, Florida. And behind the scenes, we have a couple other NLP folks. We have John Silva, who is the Senior Director of Professional and Community Learning Team. He's helping man the chat along with Liz Price, who's our Program Manager. A couple of housekeeping things. As you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A. For general comments, you can use the chat feature, and I believe we also have the closed caption enabled as well. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, and today I am so excited that we are joined by, we are joined by Jennifer LaFleur, the Senior Editor for the Center of Public Integrity. Before Jennifer joined CPI, she was at the Investigative Reporting Workshop, where she was the data editor. She also teaches data journalism at American University, and she was also the former director of data journalism at ProPublica. Jennifer has worked on a number of really important projects, from exposing abuses in the juvenile prisons to racial biases and presidential pardons. And among the many accolades received throughout her career, she's also inducted into the National Freedom of Information Act Hall of Fame in 2011, which is so cool. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so excited about this talk. So on that note, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you all for asking me, and I'm super excited about this project. I love the News Literacy Project, and I love teaching, and so I'm so happy to do this. And as I mentioned to the News Literacy folks, if you have questions, put them in the chat. I'm not good at monitoring my presentation and that, but they'll help me along the way, so feel free to ask questions during or at the end. I will leave plenty of time for questions as well. So I'm going to share my presentation and talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is Foia and the Freedom of Information Act and open records. Again, I'm with the Center for Public Integrity. We are a nonprofit newsroom focused on investigating issues of inequity. I also teach journalism at American University and love teaching and working with student journalists as well. Hold on, my screen is doing something weird. Okay, here we go. Okay, so open records are covered by a lot of different laws. So the Federal Freedom of Information Act, which was signed in 1966 by President Johnson, is our federal law that governs access to information in federal agencies. I'll get into more details about that later. There's been a lot of updates since to accommodate for things such as electronic records and advances in technology. My friends in Sweden like to remind me that they have the oldest FOIA law, 1766, 200 years before us. So there are FOIA laws all over the world. I'm not going to focus on international FOIA, but there's some really great laws around the world and some really terrible laws around the world too. States have their own laws and they're called many different things. So California, for example, has the California Public Records Act. Texas has the Public Information Act, and Missouri has the Sunshine Law. And knowing each state's law will help you make the best use of those laws. They vary widely and what you can get access to and things like that, but I'll talk more about that later. There's a thing popping up. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. So the power of freedom of information as far as a newsroom goes, you know, the foundation of most of our investigations are government records, often obtained through FOIA or through other ways if we can't get information through FOIA, but that's usually our second recourse for getting records. The first is to just ask for them. Some of the stories we've done using FOIA, this is a series of stories Public Integrity did last year, looking at workers who were not paid what they should have been, wage theft, in a whole bunch of different categories of workers, and that nothing ever happened as a result of that. This is a story from Reveal at the Center for Investigative Reporting out in California, my former employer. This is a project that Out of Agado did looking at data about migrant children and where they were detained. This was data that they worked really hard to get make public. It wasn't easy, and they were able to do stories just showing how long some of these children were detained. This is Washington Post story from a few years ago where they used FOIA and also lawsuits to obtain information about kind of what happened behind the scenes in the war on Afghanistan. Sometimes records are online and we don't have to use FOIA. I always tell people to look for them first before you go through the process of FOIA, or even just call an agency and see. Sometimes they have them online, but not in an obvious place. So rather than going through the whole FOIA process, it's always good to just check with them first. But sometimes we have to use open records laws to get them. So this is a project where the data was actually online. This is U.S. Department of Education data from the department, the Civil Rights Data Collection, which has information about policing in schools and a lot of other civil rights issues. And this focused on the police in schools and how certain children, children who are disabled and children who are not white often get called on more than others. This is a student journalism project from the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism. There are two Howard Centers, one at the University of Maryland, and this is from the one at Arizona State University. And they were looking at this little known law enforcement agency within the Department of Homeland Security. And they, oops, sorry guys, they got data looking into this incident about one shooting, and were able to take that data and expand it into looking at this whole agency that no one really knew that much about, and all of the incidents in Arizona involving this agency. This is a ProPublica project looking at NYPD civilian complaints. One thing we do a lot of, and I think some of the bigger nonprofits, so ProPublica, the Center for Investigative Reporting, Center for Public Integrity, what we do a lot is get databases. We use them for our own reporting, but then we make that available for the public to use because there's so many more applications beyond what we might be able to do with it. So we try to, whenever possible, make that available to other newsrooms and to the public. Sometimes we have to sue agencies. Sometimes they don't want to give us things. Well, many times they don't want to give us things. And sometimes we have to resort to suing agencies. And so several news organizations got together when the U.S. Department of Treasury would not release detailed information about who got Paycheck Protection Program loans. And we were part of that lawsuit and were able to pry loose detailed information about everyone who got that information. And then we made that information public. Sometimes there are cases where there just isn't, either an agency doesn't have it, or we have to get it through sources or building our own databases or other means. We've even used like satellite technology to look at landscape to get data that way. So we try to use all kinds of creative means because telling the story and getting the information out there is so important. The Pandora Papers is a big project, one of several that the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists has done. That is an international investigative newsroom. They get big troves of documents and data, make that available to other newsrooms, to the public, and also do investigations based on that information. But I always try to remember that public records are for the public, not just the news media. It's not the news media access to information, but it's the public access to information. So I always try to remember that. I had the opportunity at two former newspapers I worked at to actually write about public records for the public and had columns about it. And I got lots of questions from the public. They wanted to know about how to get information and how to get records, and we were able to give them a means to do that. So I always love doing anything I can to educate folks about getting access to information. I just ran across this from Book Riot. It's a guide, and I should say that everything, I will give you the link to the presentation later, and everything that's a story that's linkable in here, I've added the link so you can click on it and dig in a little bit more yourself. But this gives you a guide to how to get more information about challenges of books in libraries, which is kind of a big issue right now. Another project I work on, it's called the Accountability Project. It is a way, we started this project when I was at the Investigative Reporting Workshop, and we try to bring together as much public data in one spot so that people can access it in one search. So it's a collection of our work in Foia. I think we're at 1.5 billion records right now, to make that available to the public and to other newsrooms and to other interested parties. So back to the laws. State laws usually cover things like the state government, city and county governments, school districts, anything from the state government down usually is covered by state laws. It doesn't cover things like answers to questions. So sometimes I'll have an agency tell me that I need to file a FOIA for an answer to a question, and that's actually not what the law was designed to do. It also wasn't designed to make an agency create information that doesn't exist. So that's where doing our homework and knowing what we want and what an agency keeps is useful, because then we're not asking for something they don't have. Some states' courts are not under their Freedom of Information law. It just varies state to state, and a few legislatures exempted themselves from their open records laws as well. So many of those laws are very similar to FOIA, but they're different, and I'll give you some places where you can dig in if you're interested and get more information. Some states are very open and some are very restrictive, and it really varies across the nation. But you really need to understand them to make the best use of those laws. Some states have what's called an administrative appeal process. That means if you're told no, if you're denied a record, There's a process for that in some states, in others, there's not. So it just really varies across the board. So a good guide to information, especially related to student journalists, is the Student Press Law Center. It is a organization similar to the Reporters Committee, but it's focused on student law. And so it's a great resource if you are teaching student journalists or want any information about student press issues. The Reporters Committee is another organization. It's devoted to helping journalists with their legal questions. And they put together something called the Open Government Guide, which is a state-by-state guide to every open records law. And it's very valuable, especially, we sometimes have to get information from a state that we don't normally request information from. So we use that to learn about the state before we go and make our requests. There are a few states that do require you have to be a resident of that state to use their open government law. I think there's like 5 states that falls under. So do be aware of that as well. Muckrock is an organization that is devoted to helping people file open records requests. And you can actually, I'll give you some examples, but you can actually search their site to see if someone else has already requested that information. There's also state open records groups, and the overview organization for all the state open records groups is called the National Freedom of Information Coalition. I'll get into a little bit more of this. So the Reporters Committee Open Government Guide goes through basically how to use the law, what it's called, what's covered. Volunteer lawyers in each state put these together, and it's really very useful for understanding individual state laws. Muckrock has some similar tools, but again, they are designed to help people file requests, and you can actually search through their request to see if someone else has filed it. And there's links again in all of these to these organizations. Each state usually has some sort of open government, administrative agency. In Texas, it's the Attorney General's Office of Open Government. In some states, it may be another agency. They often will have a guide on how to use the open government law. And the National Freedom of Information Coalition, again, that is a coalition of state open government organizations. And if you're trying to find your state's open government organization, this is a good place to start. So the federal law, Foia, what does it cover? So it covers federal agency records, and it could be anything. It could be paper, electronic, data, even tape recordings and photos. Sometimes government contractors' records, but there's times when that doesn't always apply. It doesn't cover Congress, it doesn't cover the courts, and again, it doesn't cover answers to questions or records that do not exist. There are 9 exemptions to the federal law: national security, internal agency personnel rules, information exempt by other laws, trade secrets, internal agency memoranda, personal privacy, law enforcement investigations, federally regulated banks, and oil and gas wells. And this is where I always ask students, like, what do you think is the most used one of these exemptions? And often they will say national security, but it's actually privacy. That is the one that is used the most. So the one I have in here is other information exempt by other laws, item 3. I'm pointing to my screen like you can see me, sorry. We call that B3 information, and it is exempt by another law. So this means that, we might have a law written to make sure that, sidewalks are 3 feet wide. And at the end, it might say, oh, and by the way, any information about sidewalks is exempt from FOIA. So that's kind of how that works. For a long time, legislation wasn't required to say this is going to create an exemption to the law, but some of the FOIA reforms the more recent FOIA reforms require that any new legislation say this is going to create a B3 exemption to FOIA, which makes it a lot easier for folks to find out what might change the law. So some of the B3 exemptions. We did a project when I was at ProPublica. The Watermelon Research and Promotion Act protects any information about watermelon growers. Another law protects information about caves. So they kind of, I think there's one about honeybees too. So it kind of runs the gamut. There's also some privacy laws that keep information protected. One is called HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability Accountability Act. And that was designed to protect patient information in the run-up to electronic patient information. It was designed to protect that and make patient health data secure. Some states have stricter laws, but not everything health related is protected by HIPAA. And so what, for journalists, sometimes we'll get told that something is covered by HIPAA when it really isn't. So if there's, we have a question about whether or not, how many cases of a certain disease are in an area, sometimes we'll get told that that's private, that's HIPAA when it really isn't. So knowing the details of the laws are always helpful. One thing you all might be more familiar with is FERPA, which is the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. It was designed to protect student information. But again, sometimes that is used to cover a whole lot of other things. The Student Press Law Center has this great guide to FERPA. So if you have any questions, this is kind of your go-to resource. But they note that some of the things that get included under FERPA are things like parking tickets issued to student athletes, recordings of public meetings, and things that really aren't under the purview of what that law was written to do. I'm just keep an eye on my time here. Yell at me if I start going too long, folks.
No, you're good. We actually do have a question on a previous slide.
Oh, sure.
Debbie wanted to know, what's the honeybee exemption?
I think I don't have the law in front of me. I'd have to look at, but there is a B3 exemption for honeybee keepers. Yeah. There's a lot of agricultural exemptions that are B3 laws. Probably came about from some good lobbying on the behalf of like the watermelon industry or whatever. So yeah, there are fewer of those than there used to be, but good question.
Great, thank you.
So some ways I just kind of find out what data an agency might have and do my homework before I just go to an agency and like randomly ask for something I haven't done my homework on, which really isn't fair to them. You can do things like search for the word form on a government site and it'll bring up all their forms, because forms that get filled out, those end up in databases or those end up in records when they're filled out. So that's a good map to things that an agency might keep. Doing a Google advanced search for certain file types, like a PDF or Excel file, that often can uncover some things. Retention schedules, every agency at every level needs to have a retention schedule. And what that is a list of every record they keep and how long they have to keep them. It's a great guide to see what an agency has, and agency Foia logs. So many agencies post their other Foia requests. Now, journalists sometimes do this to see what their competition is requesting, but it's also a good way to see what other records an agency keeps. And if you're being denied something, it's a good way to see if they've released it to someone else in the past. So here I just did a search on the US Department of Education site for the word form, and it's pages and pages and pages, but it brings up all the different forms that they have, which is a good guide to kind of see what information they keep. The advanced search in Google, you can search for exact phrases, exact words, but then you can also do things like look for an Excel file, which is what I've done down here, and look for only .gov sites. So it really helps you focus your search. I've heard that they're kind of thinking about getting rid of some of these things, but hopefully the things we most use most often will be available. Here's an example of a retention schedule. So this is from Missouri. It's the public school records retention schedule. And again, it's pages and pages and pages, and I've got the link in the doc, but this is everything that schools and school districts have to keep and how long they have to keep them. Sometimes it'll also tell you what format they're in, whether or not they're in paper format or stored in data. And here is federal agencies are required under previous FOIA reforms to have what's called the FOIA reading room. And on that site, they need to have things like how to use FOIA, commonly requested records. So if records get requested multiple times, they're supposed to just post them on their site. Doesn't always happen, but some agencies are really good at it. Some are not so good at it. And just kind of a guide to how to use FOIA within that agency, who to contact. Sometimes they'll have a form so you can actually file your FOIA request in an online form if you want to do it that way. Again, another thing that's helpful is those FOIA logs. This is just an example from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services of the FOIA logs that they keep. Not all of them put them on their site, but some agencies do. Are we good on questions?
Yep.
Okay. So I just want to go through a checklist for requesting records. I don't know if any of you are records requesters or want to be, or want to work with your students to request records. But I have a few tips, and I have a few student exercises for anyone who's interested in that. So depending on the agency, usually I'll just ask, because it may be that it's something that's readily available. They're not going to require me to file a FOIA. Sometimes they'll ask, can you file a FOIA request for that? And sometimes it's because the agency or that state requires a written request. And so usually I'll just go ahead and then file the request. Most state laws and the federal law have a time requirement when the request has to be completed. And so by filing a request, usually by email these days, that kind of starts the time clock and creates the paper trail for you to go back and say, hey, it's been 20 business days. Where are my records? Find out who should get your request. And that's kind of why those FOIA reading rooms are useful, because I always tell my students and colleagues, like, don't ever send out a request to like, dear agency FOIA person, because it could just get lost somewhere. So try to find out the person it should go to and what you should ask for. And I'll give you some places to get more information about that. And you should describe what you're looking for and note that you're willing to talk or negotiate. I would say, 80% of the records I file a FOIA for, we end up doing a back and forth till we understand like what'll work for both of us. Because in my job, I request a lot of big databases, and sometimes they can't give me everything, but they can give me some of it. So that's usually where the negotiation works in. So we get a lot, we get told no, except I can't spell no. We get told no a lot. I had my friends in the newsroom I used to work in, their kids did drawings of no for me. So this is where that comes from. So know the law. By knowing the law, you kind of can buffer yourself against possible denials of records. And you can know what your next step is if you do get denied. Be persistent. Sometimes just persistency pays off. Go back and ask again, check in on your records appeal. If you get told no, appeal. Most agencies have an appeal process, especially federal agencies. And the last study I looked at, something like 40% of denials that are appealed get filled after appeal. So, there's a good chance that something might get broken loose. Find out who else has the same records. Keep in mind that records get reported to all kinds of levels. So if I report something to my county, that might then get reported to the state and then to the federal government. So if you're having trouble getting it from one level of government, try another along the way. if you're getting any data, I always ask for all the documentation that will tell me about the data. And be human. Remember, people doing open records requests are people and they should be treated nicely. They are not the enemy. They're trying to do, in most cases, they're trying to do the right thing. And in some cases, there are certain records they can't release, but understanding what they can and can't release is helpful to you. Again, follow up. I have a lot of agency folks tell me that, these people request records and then they never follow up and they never pick them up. And they're going to all this work to process the records request. So even if I'm not, I always tell everyone in my newsrooms, like, even if I'm not going to use it, I always pick it up because I always want to follow up on my request. Know the law, know the law, know the law, and be willing to negotiate and talk with them. Sometimes I'll just ask an agency to sit down and, have a conversation about all of their concerns. If it's a big request, we did that quite a bit at ProPublica because we had some pretty hefty national data requests. And, that was usually the way we could iron things out. And if something is denied that is like really in the public interest, we usually write about it. So this is the Eagle is the AU, American University student paper, and the university stopped reporting COVID numbers. So they're writing about that. My former newsroom, Reveal, from the Center for Investigative Reporting, wrote about their push to get the Labor Department to release information about Silicon Valley diversity in the companies in Silicon Valley. They fought for a really long time and eventually got that data released. But writing about it is part of what helped support their effort. We had a reporter when I was at the Center for Investigative Reporting who wanted to get daycare information because she'd had some reports from parents about problem daycare centers. And in most states, that's pretty blatantly public record. Most states have it online. You can search it. This was in California, and it was not readily available at all. In fact, if a family wanted to find out about, look around at daycare centers, they could go to a regional office of the state and they could request 5 files and look through those 5 files. I don't know how they were supposed to come up with those files, but that is how it worked there. So we decided we were going to make those records available. So we went to all the regional offices and I think we scanned 10,000 daycare records and made them available online. We had a bunch of students helping us. We decided we were going to have fun of it. We had a reality TV show called Scanner Wars. And the funny thing is the documents we were scanning were things that were in a computer that were printed out, put in a folder, and then we were rescanning them into a computer. But the state eventually made the information available, which is great because it's a really important tool for parents. So some do's and don'ts. Again, in addition to everything else I've covered, find other ways to get what you need. If it's an important enough story that, we're going to try to figure out another way to do it. Although I sometimes like negotiating for public records. So sometimes when I get a no, I get a little excited because I have a new hobby, but that's just me. But there are other ways to get at what you need. It might be through sourcing or through other creative ways. I mean, we obviously do everything in legal ways, but we wanted to write about actually, I'll show you a story about that. We wanted to write about the drought in California and we couldn't get the records we needed. So we needed to do some other creative ways to get that data. Be ready to make your case because again, most of the time we get told no, even things that are blatantly public record. So then we have to go through the process of making our case for the records. Some of the things I run across, our computer system can't do that. Usually that's not the case, but the key is to finding the person who knows the computer system so they can tell you, more about it. And I've often had meetings with, the computer department at an agency and the public information department, so we can all work together to try to figure out the best way to release something. Because I'm requesting stuff on behalf of the public, and it's usually not stuff I don't want for myself. I want it because there's an important story to be told with that information. Sometimes I'll have agencies tell me that we can give you printed pages, and it might be like something that's in a database that would be much easier to use in a database, but they'll just print it out. And some states allow that under their law, some don't. Our database is on a mainframe and it's very complicated. Missy, I used to get that a lot. So yeah, sometimes data is stored in complicated data systems, and usually there's a way to work with them to get around that. Things like big charges. So if an agency charges $1 for one copy of something and I want the whole database, sometimes they'll come back with, that's $25,000, which is not usually under state law. You really only have to pay what it costs to produce the data. So a copy of a database usually doesn't cost that much. The information is protected by law. I always want to find out, under what, and it might be that something I ask for is truly protected under a public records law, but I always want to know what, exemption is covered, is protecting it, so that I can inform myself and stop bothering them if it truly is protected. Sometimes it's kind of a gray area where we don't really know, and I have to work with our lawyers to figure out if it's really open or not. We don't keep that on a computer. That's pretty rare these days. So most of the time, things that are on a computer are a little bit easier to use, and getting it in a data format makes it a little bit more efficient to use. So I'm just going to go over one example. Alex mentioned the project we did on youth prison systems in Texas. We wanted to look at abuse allegations made against prison guards in the youth prisons. And my colleague had like 32 boxes of hard copy documents, and he was sifting and sorting through them on paper. And I'm like, no, we should just get this in data format, because it'll be more efficient. It'll be, easier and more accurate. So we're going to just ask for the data. So I did that. And they told me that the information is protected by law, but they'd already released the paper records. So I responded saying, you already provided this information in paper format. I'm just asking for the same thing electronically. Please explain the difference. I always throw my bosses and my editors under the bus, as I tell my reporters to do. So we got into some complicated things about hourly charges and what system it's in. And I just keep communicating back to them, because I had heard it was in a certain kind of computer system. I told them that they can just do a query, and I can happy to help them with the query, or help your computer folks with the query. And I just keep going. And the next response I got was, we need a mailing address. So eventually I did get the information. We did do a series of stories showing abuses in the youth prison system in Texas, and the state actually took over the system and hopefully made a difference for some kids. So that's why I keep pursuing these records. A couple other tools. The Student Press Law Center, again, I mentioned them earlier, but they have a letter generator. So if you want to do a public records request, they have a letter generator that you can fill out the agency and what you're trying to request, and it'll generate the letter for you. I almost always kind of need to tweak the letter just a little bit, but it's a really good way to put together your initial request letter. And I was hoping, above all hope, that my cats would be quiet through all this. So if you hear weird noises in the background, it's because Oliver suddenly woke up and he's crying. So I apologize on behalf of him. I'm sure he's like, something is tragic happening in his life. So the Reporters Committee also has a letter generator tool. It's called iFoia. It also lets you file requests through iFoia, kind of like Muckrock does. And it's got a lot of helpful tips and tools for how to file your FOIA requests. The neat thing about this is if you're filing a federal request and you know the agency name, it can fill out all the other information for you. Have a few exercises that if you do work with students that I've used with my students. So a couple things I do is a records hunt where I give them lots of places to go look at open records laws, and then have them dig in and look at a set of questions. So like, how long do agencies have to respond? Are electronic records covered? Is, are, birth records covered under the public information law? And then have them do some digging so that they can get more information. This is something that's really helpful if anyone ever needs to do a future public records request. And as someone who hires students and interns, I always appreciate students that come in with a little bit of FOIA experience. We also do a negotiating exercise where I make them be the requester, the custodian of the records, and an observer, and they have to negotiate with each other for records. And then everybody switches roles and they talk about how it went. So that one's kind of fun. They're all in this presentation. So, and the presentation is at that bit.ly address, and I'm sure the folks at the News Literacy Project will share that out as well. And my information, feel free to reach out. And thank you so much. And I'm happy to take questions or comments or anything else now. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So I'm going to kick it off with one question that's in the chat. There's a trend of folks calling out organizations, groups on social media to raise awareness about a particular issue or problem. Is this ever relevant in the case of an agency refusing to release certain records? And how could social media be leveraged to gain access to sensitive information?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would hope that the law covers what is public or not public in any state or federal government. I think sometimes getting a bit of public outcry that something needs to be released can be helpful. I know when the PPP loan stuff was not being released in detail, there was a lot of outcry on social media about, the public needs to know who's getting this money. So I do think it can be useful in that way, if it's something that technically should fall under the law.
Gotcha.
Good question.
Yeah, and I just want to remind everyone to feel free to use the Q&A feature. But Jennifer, so for really big investigative pieces, it's now pretty common for reporters to essentially build in news literacy into the stories themselves by detailing the behind the scenes journalism process. I'll read really in-depth investigations that detail how many public records they poured over, how many people worked on it, how long it took. And so I'm curious, how important is it to you for journalists to kind of peel back the curtain on that process? Because it feels like the detailing the behind the scenes has become more prevalent.
Yeah, and I think honestly, a lot of that has come about through our ability to share more information online. And I think transparency about what we do is so important, because there's not a magic wand. And I want people to know how we got from A to B to C, because I think for readers to have faith that we're actually doing things correctly, anytime we can do share information about how we did something, all the better. In some of the really complicated data analyses I've done, we've even done white papers that kind of map out everything we did with the data. And we even share the data too.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And it seems like readers need the news literacy part of it to also, as you said, build back trust. And it's a way for journalists to be even more transparent in the process. Back to data. So we often hear that numbers don't lie or that data doesn't lie, but we know that data without context can be used to tell any number of stories, or it can also be used to spread misinformation. So do you have any guidance for educators on what students should be looking for to judge if something is credible?
I have a whole other session on that, but
yeah,
I could talk about that a lot. Yeah, I think one thing, I actually ban my students from saying the word assume, because they have to know what's in the data and what it means. And also, we need to know the source of the data. So I always try to get students to get data from primary sources rather than if anybody says, oh, I got the data off the internet, it makes my head explode. I want to know who got, even things that seem like they're good data sources, like communities often have data portals. Just warning, we're getting a little stormy here. So if my power goes out, I'll thank you all now. I just saw a flash of lightning. So
you're good. I'm in Florida and I'm looking up probably there's something very similar.
Anyhow, just really knowing the source of the data, because even like data portals for cities, those aren't always like the most current and best data sources from the individual agency. So I even have students who get something from like the city's data portal, go back to the agency and say, is this your most current data? And every data set is dirty. There's always problems with missing data. So we do a lot of checks of the data to make sure that it is as accurate as possible. And if there are caveats in the data, that we disclose those in the story.
Right. That makes sense. And just for our teachers, like, what are some examples? You had so many really amazing stories and examples throughout this entire presentation. So I'm so glad that we can share those with everyone who's here. But I'm wondering if you have any other examples of news pieces or other types of information that you feel have done really well in presenting data in consumable ways. And where can teachers turn to for examples of really great work?
Oh gosh, there's so many good examples. I mean, most of the data work I work on is investigative. So I would say the IRE, Investigative Reporters and Editors, has a good collection of data-driven investigations. But there's also just a lot of great sites out there. The Data Journalism Awards, which is an international contest. They have, and I can send that to you guys so you can share it out too. They have amazing projects from all over the world. And so when my students think like, we're the only ones that do this kind of stuff, I always share that site because there's so many amazing projects going on around the world. And in some of them, it's like places where there isn't a good freedom of information law, and they're really having to, do a lot of work just to get the information for the public.
Right. I think that there was a slide earlier in your presentation about public records not answering questions. I think I saw that right. Can you kind of elaborate on what you mean by that?
So sometimes we'll run into, if we want to ask a question of an agency, like just some sort of overall question about something, as we do in interviews, sometimes they will require us to file a public records request for answers to questions. And that is not what the law is designed to do. The law is designed to, for you to get access to existing records. So sometimes there's a little bit of confusion on the part of the person we might be dealing with. Sometimes there will be records that within those records might answer your questions. But that's one of the things to be careful of. If an agency just says, oh, we can't talk to you because you need a public records request, that actually isn't true.
Gotcha. This is just like something I'm curious about. When you're when you're evaluating potential stories or things that you want to like look deeper into, what would you say is needed for a strong investigation?
So there, you know, the one thing I always tell students, at least, is like, you know, find something that is not just like a noun, but a problem that needs to be solved, or a system that needs to be held accountable. So we always, for example, at Public Integrity, we look for things that are, you know, are systems of inequality. So that's something that we look for in our investigations. But also you need to have something where you're going to have some findings, like hard findings, where you can say, these are the things going on. I had, when I worked for Reveal, we had a series of questions about any investigation, and I'm probably going to mess these up, but one of them was, you know, are you able to hold someone accountable? Are you able to show wrongdoing? Are you able to humanize the story? Are there people? Because no one wants to read a story that's just like number, and no people. You know, is whatever you're showing quantifiable? So is there data or numbers that can help tell the whole story? So those are some of the questions we ask. Yeah.
Thank you. And this will be the final question, but please, everyone in attendance, hold on. So we have a couple of announcements after this, and I'll share my screen for. But Kate asked if an agency uses a legacy or proprietary database, does asking for the raw data file usually work for you?
Usually. Sometimes it takes some finagling, and sometimes it takes finding the right person, because I might be dealing with a public records office that doesn't know that much about the database. So we're actually in a big request right now where we've had to get to the people who actually work with the data so that they can help explain how the system works. I've been doing this for a long time, and I've only had one case where a system could not output its raw data. But that would be very, very rare.
Interesting. Well, Jennifer, I just want to say thank you again so much for joining us for this webinar. This has been so amazing, and we really appreciate those activities that could be plugged into the classroom. Those are really cool. I'm going to share my, just going to share my screen very quickly for a couple of announcements on our upcoming session, as well as our survey. So next week we have our session all about understanding bias, and that will be next Wednesday, the 14th at 5 p.m. And I just want to share the survey. Your feedback is really, really, really important to us and extremely valued. So if you could please take the time to let us know your thoughts on this session, it would be extremely, extremely helpful. So I'll leave this on the screen for a little bit. And I also want to talk about the fact that after next week's session, our final webinar series will also be with the Center, we'll have another session with the Center for Public Integrity, and that again is at 5 p.m. on not next week, but the week following. Jennifer, I just want to say thank you again so much for joining us. This has been so wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. This was fun. You do great work. I really love this project.
Amazing. We appreciate it. All right. Thanks, everyone, so much for joining. Please fill out that survey if you get a chance. Bye, Jennifer.
Bye.